So welcome everyone to tonight's program. My name is Dennis Krebs. I'm the director here at the Bridgman Public Library. And I will tell you at the outset here how pleased I am that there are so many people who have embraced this. It doesn't necessarily feel quite so new now, but this format, this virtual format for programs, this enables us to have great people like William, whom I will introduce in a moment, people who wouldn't be able to travel as regularly to come to the library for programs. We still get to hear from them. We still get to see them because we can do this virtually. And the reason that we get to keep doing this is from support like you all who continue to attend programs in this way. So with that backing, we certainly feel comfortable continuing to offer programs in this way. So that works out really well for all of us. And so I wanted to thank you all for attending. Again, thank you all for embracing the brave new world, as it were, or being a part of the brave new world. We thank you for doing that. So our presenter tonight is William Hazelgrove. And if you have attended many of our programs, you may have attended one in which William has presented. So William is a national best-selling author, 10 novels and 7 nonfiction titles. His books have received starred reviews in Publishers Weekly, Kirkus Book List, Book of the Month selections, ALA Editor's Choice Awards, Junior Library Guild selections, Literary Guild selections, History Book Club selections, and I did not know this option for movies, but I'm not surprised, but I did not know that. So he has won any number of awards, and his works have received, have been well acclaimed in a number of places, some more popular publications and some specifically literary publications. So that's awesome. He was the Ernest Hemingway Writer in Residence, where he wrote he wrote in the attic of Ernest Hemingway's birthplace. He's written articles and reviews for USA Today, the Smithsonian Magazine, and other publications, and has been featured on NPR's All Things Considered, New York Times, LA Times, Chicago Tribune, C-SPAN, USA Today. So some of his books, Madam President is one that he has presented here, about Sally Rand, American Sex Symbol is another. So actually, it looks like there are several of these books have been optioned for screen and television rights. That's awesome. So tonight's program, tonight's presentation is a focus on the Titanic. And I think what I will do at this point, so it's the 160 minutes, the race to save the Titanic. So with no further ado, I think I will turn it over to William. And so welcome, William, and we are glad you are here. We are thrilled that you come back to us for programs. You have such a variety of options about what you've written. One of the things that I will say to you all too is that as William and I were chatting prior to the program, one of the things that I think is really fabulous about William's writing style, but also the focus, I will call it, of his writing often is that there are overlooked details or an underlying story that becomes the focal point of William's writing, even if it's a person or people or an event that we're all familiar with. What William does a great job of, in my opinion, is uncovering the untold stories. So we look forward to hearing about the untold stories related to the Titanic. All right. Thank you, William. Take it away.
Okay, thank you. Thanks everybody for being here. I hope everybody can understand me. I know the internet's a little tricky tonight, so shout at me if I'm breaking up or something like that. I'm trying to keep bandwidth low so I don't put a lot of pressure on the system. This was in the Chicago Tribune last week. Full page Rick Cogan, maybe some of you are familiar with him. He's WGN. He's on Sunday nights, but he also is a great newspaperman, and he did this whole article on the book, and he did a great job of summing up. And then this was also in the Daily Express in the UK. The book is doing well in England. They sort of like, they have these big tabloids, and they seem to cover a lot of my books with them. You can see here they did the movie thing with it and all that. And was Dennis and I were talking before. I got a lot of reactions. So with that, let's get to the main show here and move right along and get past all this stuff here. Okay. I was always fascinated with Titanic, but I could never find an angle on it. I could never find a way into the book or into the story, if you will. I love the movie. If we were all in person, I'd say, who saw the movie? And everybody would raise their hand. It's a great movie, but it has a lot of mythology in it. And what I do in all my books, from Madam President to the Wright brothers, to Teddy Roosevelt, to Al Capone, I get into the mythology and present what I think is the real story. And that's what I did with Titanic. I really wanted to find something that wasn't covered. So I focused on the wireless. I focused on wireless telegraphy and the two operators. And that sort of opened up a whole can of worms that really made me see that Titanic's fate was not preordained. It wasn't a great Greek tragedy, that in fact, a lot more people could have been saved if it wasn't for human failing. So saying that, I'm not going to tip my hand all the way. Let's jump right in. Okay, so in 1915, there's a fisherman off the coast of New Jersey, and he sees his bottle with a little note in it. And he picks it up, takes out the note, and it says, "From Titanic, goodbye all, Burke of Glanmere Cork." So one would think at this point, Burke of Glanmere Cork was going down and threw the bottle off into eternity, let the world know what happened to him. The problem is there's no Burke of Glanmere Cork on Titanic. And it really came to light that this was just a joke. But this made it into a lot of histories. It's made into mythology. So, this is how Titanic grows. The mythology of Titanic grows. Little things become big things. And one reason that is because of this. It was a big thing. Titanic was incredibly large for its size. It was like the space shuttle of its time. So the mythology began right away. And of course, it began with the unsinkable moniker that was stapled to it, which, we're going to talk about. But this was the cutting edge technology of these big steamships crossing the Atlantic. And, these steamships were their sort of spaceships of this time. So the mythology started right away. It grew at various points. We're going to talk about that. But by the time it got to 1997, the movies ran with it. And, a lot of the things in Titanic were true, and a lot of things weren't. But, this is a big event. And so big mythology grew out of it. And one reason that we have a certain view of Titanic is because of this gentleman, Walter Lord, he's a young copywriter in New York, and he starts interviewing survivors in the 1950s. Now, he had a great advantage. He could talk to people who are actually on Titanic. And I think the last survivor, she died, close to 2000. But the point is, this is a very, very small book that he published. A Night to Remember. It's only 112 pages. And it's basically a you are there. It's a very voyeuristic journey on the night the Titanic sunk. And you know, it's not wrong. It's just where Walter Lord decided to put his camera. So, and because of that, every history that has followed since has a lot of Walter Lord's book in it. And you can always sort of find it at the core. And so, you know, this, when I did the book, The Wright Brothers' Wrong Story, there's a guy named Fred Kelly who also wrote a biography that was skewed, and all the histories were based on it, though. So, you know, there's always sort of a smoking gun here. And again, Lord's book is not wrong. It's just he set the stage for a certain kind of view of that night. Now, like I said, he focused on the survivors. Now, these are actual photos of the Carpathia. And this was a first-class couple on their honeymoon. They don't look worse to wear, right, for being on the Atlantic? Well, that's because a lot of the first class were fine in those boats because there weren't a lot of people in those lifeboats. And we'll talk about that too. In fact, they don't look like they got wet at all. And it looks like they're more concerned with now what? Now what do we do on our honeymoon? But again, Lord was really focusing on the survivors. But there is a real story of Titanic that hasn't gotten a lot of play. And again, I show this photo to just show you, you know, how monstrous the props were, where they had to bring all these horses just to bring it to the ship. So this is a big ship, and it's going to tell a big story. And that big story begins at 11:40 a.m., April 14th, 1912, where Titanic hits a 500 billion ton iceberg. It's sort of like taking a tricycle and running to the Sears Tower. So when it hits, here's a couple of things you want to take away from this. One, if Titanic had hit it head on, it would not have sunk. Why? Because it would have only flooded the first two compartments at most. But what Titanic did was it threw the engines in reverse, turned, water cavitated around the rudder, and suddenly it just scraped the side of the Titanic and opened it like a can opener. You know, and again, it was sort of a perfect storm of events that allowed Titanic to be so heavily damaged, tearing open up to 5 compartments. Now, most people didn't hear this. If you've ever been on a cruise, I've been on several, you know what you do. You go have a big 7-course meal. You then have a big dessert. Then you might go to a show. You might have a drink. You might smoke a cigar. And then you collapse in your bed because you're just full of food and everything else. Well, on Titanic, they did exactly that, except it was a brutally cold night and the Atlantic was strangely calm. But everybody went into their beds, got into their White Star blankets, turned on their electric heaters. Now, most people didn't hear Titanic scrape this iceberg. One woman said it sounded like calico tearing. Another woman said it sounded like gravel or marbles on the outside of the ship. The sort of low grinding. Lawrence Beasley, who was a schoolmaster, noticed that the engine stopped and the vibration changed in his water glass. So it was very subtle. Most people heard nothing at all. So 11:41, and by the way, the name of my book is 160 minutes, and that's because it took 160 minutes, 2 hours, 40 minutes for it to sink from the time it struck the iceberg to when it sank. And in the book, I count down the 160 minutes with each chapter. All right, so at 11:41, the watertight doors close. Now, let's talk about these. This is the big reason everybody said Titanic was unsinkable. Makes sense. Each bulkhead seals off a part of the ship. So the water comes into a couple of compartments. You close the watertight doors. They're only going to fill so much because the ship is only going to go to a certain angle. Compartments flood, the ship goes down a little more. 4, it goes down a little more. But mathematically, it's not going to go up. Now, what's the problem? The problem is the bulkheads only go up to E deck. Okay, they don't go all the way through the ship. They go to E deck. Titanic had 5 compartments flooded. So think of a canoe with a big weight in the front of it, an anchor, pulling the front down. And as it goes down, the water comes up and over E deck and into the next compartment. Think of yourself sitting in your living room watching your television, and suddenly you leave the window open in your bedroom fills up with water and it comes over the ceiling and floods your living room. Well, that's what's happening in Titanic. Or it was inverting down and it was going up like water goes over stairs. So that's how the architect Andrews, who built the ship, knew it was a mathematical certainty Titanic would sink. Because with 5 compartments flooded, the angle was too much, the water could jump over that bulkhead and eventually would fill up the entire ship. So the watertight doors did nothing except slow it down some. Now, there was a lot of controversy of how was Titanic damaged. A lot of people thought it was just a huge rent, a big, gash in the side that just went, all along the side. Well, when they discovered it in 1985, Ballard discovered it. They sent down a robot that had sonar capabilities. Now, Titanic had gone down and smashed into the sand and buried herself, so you couldn't see, down in the hull where the damage was. So they sent a sonar robot down there, and it could see that there were 6 long slits, 20 feet below the water line. And these 6 long slits let in 39,000 tons of water. And so that's why she was doomed. So at 12:05, Captain Smith orders the lifeboats uncovered. Now let's talk about Captain Smith, because he's part of this mythology. In the movie, he looks a lot like he actually looks. And that was kind of true to order. The befuddled look on his face after Titanic struck the iceberg. Why? Because he had 30 years of nothing really happening. He even said in an interview, said that shipwrecks are a thing of the past. Our technology is too advanced for that. He's being told he's a little stunned, and the second officers have to keep saying to him. Then he goes down to the wireless room. Now, this is at 12:10. Let's talk about wireless. Wireless telegraphy was the internet and the PC of the early 1980s. Remember that? People were like, what is this thing? And there were computer nerds, weird people that were, into these computer things. And it wasn't widely disseminated. Well, that was wireless telegraphy in 1912. It was viewed as a gadget. It was viewed as almost a plaything. Ships, a lot of ships had it, some didn't. Guglielmo Marconi had sort of a lock on the growing industry. He was the one putting on these young 20-somethings on the ships. Now, the operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, were sort of the equivalent of computer nerds. They didn't work for White Star. They worked for Marconi. They were specially trained. They knew Morse. They had their own lingo. They didn't mix with the crew. They lived basically in the wireless room because they had sleeping quarters. Titanic had the most powerful wireless set that you could have on a ship. It had 5,000 watt range. All right, so what does this mean? Well, it meant that during the day, it had about a 500-mile range, but at night, because the ionosphere was there, they could bounce those signals, these Hertzian waves, 2,000 miles, which would put it all the way into America. So this was a very strange technology. Captain Smith had gotten many ice warnings from them before this happened. Famously, we know Smith was going full speed. We know Bruce Ismay was on board saying, let's set a record. Smith barges into this ice field. And yet, did he see the ice warnings? Yes. Did he take them seriously? Somewhat. Smith was of the ilk of captains who believed they knew best. And why wouldn't he be? All his career, he was the main guy. Suddenly you had these two young 20-something guys going, there's an iceberg, you want to turn the ship. He would decide and make those decisions. So it wasn't viewed as this life-saving technology. Mostly what Marconi did was he made his money off of passengers. He first-class passengers, it was very expensive to send a telegram, but they loved to send a telegram to New York and say, hey, I'm on Titanic. Also, they would download, I'm going to use a 21st century term, information from, say, Cape Race at Nova Scotia and get all this news. And then Titanic had big printing presses, and they would put out their own newspaper. So when the first-class passengers had their croissant and coffee in the morning, they could read about the Chicago Cubs if they wanted. This was viewed as just wow technology. Okay, so it was viewed as a pleasure item, as almost a plaything. But now Smith goes down. He says, "We've hit an iceberg. Put out CQD. Come quick distress." He suddenly realizes that all the technology of this monstrous ship with these monstrous engines, cutting edge technology, All depends on these 220-something guys in this little room with this strange new technology. And so they do. They start to send out the signal. Now here's Jack Phillips. He's on the left there. He's the senior operator. Titanic was also luxurious enough to have two operators who work 24/7. So, you know, again, they had stacks and stacks of messages to send from all these first-class passengers who wanted to send. Third class could not afford to send a telegram. Again, it was very, very expensive. Also, the system for sending telegrams was very streamlined for the passengers. There were pneumatic tubes. It came down a pneumatic tube. It was sent back in a pneumatic tube. The process for ice warnings was you walked it up to the bridge, gave it to somebody, and maybe they looked at it, maybe they didn't. So again, the focus was really on a sort of, you know, social thing, a gadget, if you will. And here's Harold Bride. He's the junior Marconi operator. And again, they don't work for White Star. Now, this is an actual photo, the only one that exists, of the Marconi room, the wireless room on Titanic. It's double exposed. That's why it's sort of ghostly. That's Harold Phillips sitting there. But at 12:15, this first CQD goes out. And there's a lot of talk about Titanic sent the first SOS. It did not. It was other ships had used it, but Titanic did use SOS after the CQD, which was the news signal. Now, we're going to test our own technology here because I'm going to try and let you hear, if I can, what this sounded like. Let's give it a shot. We're going to test our bandwidth and see if we can actually hear the sound of Titanic's distress signal. Let me try it again here. Okay. Okay, here we go. Let's try it here. So that's what it sounded like. That was the actual sound of the distress signal. And you can see how fast it's coming, how it's not that clear, crisp little dots and dashes. So you have to be pretty skilled. And it's even, you know, and that was probably very clear. Usually there's a lot of electrical interference, sort of like a fuzzy radio. So this was cutting edge technology, but it was the very edge. Now, as I said before, Titanic could broadcast 2,000 miles. This is a very, very rare photo, the only one that exists, of Titanic's antennas, which you didn't see in the movie. See them, how high they are? And the four, that's off of the Marconi set there, right? They put those things very, very high so they could broadcast very far. Now, question is, who heard these signals first, all right? So, by the way, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride are putting out these signals over and over and over. Come quick distress, CQD, they give longitude, latitude, come quick distress, longitude, latitude, because they don't know who's going to get it, and it's all on the same frequency. So, you know, it's sort of like early days of everybody's stepping on each other. So he's just blasting this out. So 350 miles away is Cape Race. Now, these wireless stations on land were studies in isolation. They had to be close to the water to pick up the signal. You can see the antenna in the background. The people slept there. They took their meals there. This one was particularly isolated in Newfoundland. And the two adults had gone out that night, April 14th, 1912, to work on the diesel engine. They left behind a kid named Jimmy Merrick, who was only 14. He's sitting there bored. It's, you know, it's raining. It's not a great night. And suddenly his headset goes off and he hears these signals. And he starts to decipher it. And it's the Titanic. And it says they're sinking. They've hit an iceberg. He runs out and tells the adults. The adults confirm it. Then they turn to him and say, never ever tell anybody you were the only one here when Titanic was struck and you received the signal. We'll lose our jobs. And he never did. 50 years later, he told a newspaper. That's how I found out about it. But he waited that long, okay? But the first person to hear Titanic sinking was a 14-year-old boy. Now, these are actual transmissions to kind of tell you what was going out. CQD is Titanic, that gives its position. All right, so now there was 10 to 12 ships around Titanic. Now here's the big epiphany I had when doing this book, was there was a huge rescue operation. All these ships started to turn around. So the Frankfurt says, what's the matter? He gives his position. Okay, stand by. The Mount Temple is one of the first ships to hear Titanic, says, what's the matter? He says, I can't read you, old man, but here's my position. Now, a lot of times, Jack Phillips didn't know if anybody heard him because he didn't get a return transmission. Again, this was, it was sort of catching these waves as best you can. So you had to kind of go with faith that people were hearing you. Sometimes they could get back to you. A lot of times they couldn't. But this is actually where Mount Temple was in relation to Titanic. We're going to talk about her a lot. And you can see there are other ships. There's a Parisian, California. We're going to talk about her, Burma, Frankfurt. There's a lot of ships. Part of the mythology of Titanic is it's a Greek tragedy. That means that it's preordained, that she was destined to sink and there's nothing anybody could do. Well, this blows that away because there was actually a lot of ships in the area. And all these ships started to turn around and head for Titanic, because the rule at sea is if somebody calls for you and is in distress, you've got to go to their aid. But again, wireless was a new technology. Again, it was sort of the internet of their time. And so there weren't rules to gauge it, governing it. It was very haphazard. There was very different Morse code systems in play. So, the ships would get the signals at various distance from Titanic. They'd turn around and come toward her. A lot of times they weren't even quite sure if it was Titanic. They just knew that a ship was in trouble. Now, here's a replica of that wireless room. We saw the photo, but they recreated it here. And you can see it's basically the transmitters. There's the tubes to call up and down. And it's, there's not a lot to it. Here is a very old illustration, but I thought it was a good one, showing, Titanic that night and how many ships were around her, right? You have Carpathia, the Baltic, the Mauritania, Cincinnati, the Prince Frederick Wilhelm, Olympic, her sister ship. We'll talk about her. Here's Cape Race over here. We talked about Jimmy Merrick there, the California. So she was sort of surrounded by ships, right? So these Hertzian signals are bouncing out into the night, and it's a brilliantly cold night. So these signals go really far on a cold night. And so these ships are all turn around to try and get, so the race is on. They have 150 minutes to get to Titanic to rescue her. Now, Olympic is her sister ship. She is just a little smaller than Titanic. She's 500 miles away, but she too has a very powerful set. So she sort of ends up being a relay station, sending on telegrams, relaying information, because she too can lob these signals almost 2,000 miles at night. Now I wanted to show you this picture. These are the lifeboats. These were actually taken off Carpathia. And I want you to look at these and see how reinforced they are, how big they are. They can hold up to 75 people. And clearly they're high out of the water. There's a reason I know this, but look how reinforced those boats are. They are very substantial boats. Now, there's a ship called the Californian, and the Californian is very famous. It's full of all sorts of controversy. The Californian was commanded by a guy named Captain Lord, who was an imperious captain, very stern, old school captain. Now, what happened to Titanic is she didn't just hit an iceberg. She stumbled into a monstrous ice field full of birds, growlers, all sorts of things. Californian hits the same ice field, except Captain Lord throws on the brakes and says, I'm not going any further. We're going to shut down the engine and ride this out right where we are. Now, they have a wireless man, and their wireless guy knows Titanic's in the area, and he has some messages for her, because a lot of times, this is sort of the original sharing. The way the wireless worked is somebody would pick up a message and they'd be like, "Oh, got a message for Titanic. Can you relay it?" And then they'd relay it. So he had a message for Titanic. He tries to break in. Now, when you're close to another ship, and the Californian is only 10 miles away from Titanic, 10 miles. When you're close, it's like a radio turned up full blast. You break in on somebody and it just blows your ears off. Well, Jack Phillips is trying to relay all these messages to Cape Race from all these passengers before they hit the ice. And so this operator says, "Hey, I've got some messages for you." And Phillips retorts and says, shut up, you're jamming me." Now this ship only has one operator. And he says, "You know what? I'm tired. I'm going to bed." And he takes his headset off and turns off the set. So essentially, the California is asleep. Its ears are off. Its engine shut down. They put up an extra light on the mast to let other ships know she's not moving, and she's only 10 miles away from the Titanic. Now, this is probably going to really blow your mind. But as they're loading the passengers into the lifeboats of Titanic, Captain Smith, Second Officer Lightoller, and others told them, "See that light? See that light right there? That's a ship. They're gonna come pick you up. Row toward that light. Row toward that light." They told all the people in the lifeboats, row toward the light, because that ship's so close, they're gonna pick you up because they're gonna probably come to us. And this wasn't a few people. There's Jack Thayer, the 17-year-old, and his mother, who, when Thayer wrote his book in 1940, they all say, "We saw the ship clearly. It was right there." I mean, it's just account after account after account. And so these people did. They started rowing toward this light. Now, on the other side of the ice field is Captain Moore and the Mount Temple. Now, Captain Moore got the signal first among all the ships, and he's 40 miles away, maybe closer. We aren't exactly sure. So he starts heading for Titanic, full speed. Puts all the steam into his engine, sets up his lifeboats, everything, gets a sort of hospital part of the ship ready. He's going to go rescue these passengers, and he's coming full speed now. Now, the Carpathia at 12:25 receives Titanic CQD. She's 50 miles away, and she gets this notice late. She gets the CQD late. Captain Rostrom, he's called the electric spark because he's so energetic. He flips his ship around, diverts all the steam from the passengers, all the hot water, puts it all into the engines, puts up 5 lookouts, uncovers all the lifeboats, sets up sort of a triage station, outfits his whole boat to rescue these passengers, and takes off like a bat out of hell for Titanic, ready to weave around all these icebergs that could easily sink him too. Meanwhile, during all of this, there's a guy named David Sarnoff, a young 20-something, in Manhattan. He's sitting up on top of Wanamaker's department store. Now, Wanamaker's was the Marshall Fields of the time. And so Mr. Wanamaker wanted to allow people to, go send a message if they wanted. It was kind of a cool thing for the customers. Well, David Sarnoff, this young 20-something, is bored. He's sitting there. Suddenly his headset goes off. He deciphers it. It's the Titanic, saying we struck a berg and we're sinking. He can't believe it, but he runs and tells this little raglan newspaper, the New York Times. And by the way, David Sarnoff will become a media mogul later and start RCA. Now, conversely, this technology was cheap. A lot of boys had wireless sets. It was sort of a hobby almost. You didn't need a lot to have one. You could string the antenna up on your roof. So these 4 boys in New Jersey got together, and they would get together in the kitchen after the parents went to sleep and see what they could pick up, anything, right? And they sit there with the headsets on. And so on this night, this stormy night in New Jersey, suddenly they get these crazy signals from the ocean, from Titanic, saying we're sinking. They run and tell their parents say, no, that's not Titanic. And by the way, it's unsinkable. So there's no way that could be from Titanic. And they just don't believe them. But the newspapers will run this story later and determine that it was true, that they had actually heard, the Titanic, which is amazing. Now, at 12:45, Titanic starts to shoot up rockets. But let's back up a little. On the Californian, Captain Lord has gone to sleep. And they're like, there's a ship. What we see, this second officer saying, we see the ship, and we think it might be the Titanic. It looks very strange in the water. Lord looks at it and says, no, that's not Titanic. But he does go down to the wireless operator who's in bed and says, hey, ship's in there. He goes, only Titanic. Still, Lord says, nah, that's some Russian fishing trawler, probably fishing illegally. Let me know if anything changes. And he goes to sleep. Well, things do change. The boat looks strange. The ship looks stranger and stranger. And then rockets go off. So they call Lord back up. And he says, well, what color are the rockets? And they said, well, they're white. And he says, well, let me know if anything changes. Now, rockets at sea mean only one thing: distress. Come quickly. Come immediately. All right. That's all it means. It doesn't matter what color it is. So, but again, Captain Lord has determined this is not a ship that needs assistance, even though it looks like it's sinking to the second officers on the bridge of the California, and now it's shooting off rockets. Meanwhile, Carpathia is coming full speed, zigzagging around icebergs, doing everything she can to get there before Titanic sinks. Now, who's in the lifeboats? Well, the first class passengers are in the lifeboats. Why is this? Because the third class are down below in steerage. All right, so a lot of this is class driven. All right, at this time, classes were clearly distinguished and they were accepted that. It was accepted, the first class were privileged. And so the first class actually knew a lot of the pursers and stewards. And so they were ushered into these lifeboats. The lifeboats rowed away. Many times the boats were half full, if even that, all right? And so they rowed away, and then they just sat there and watched Titanic sink. And what's going on Titanic? Well, after most of the boats had left, up comes the third class. And they hit the top, and it's very apparent there's no way off this ship. Now, in the movie, we see one officer pull out a gun, shoot one person, and then shoot himself. Letters surfaced later. Actually, Walter Lord wrote a second book, and he discovered these letters had been written after the tragedy, that on both two accounts, they described how 12 people were shot by, and how this turned into a riot on the Titanic. And why wouldn't it be a riot? You knew now the ship was sinking. You knew there was no way off, and you were going to the Atlantic. And maybe there was one or two boats, and you were damn sure you're going to get into it. So the officers started shooting people down. So this is not what made it into the movies. It's not what made it into mythology, where we're used to sort of the, a shot of brandy and a cigar, send off the women and children and go down like gentlemen. That is not really what happened on Titanic. Now at 2 a.m., Captain Smith comes down to Jack Bride and Harold Phillips, and he says, look, man, you've done your duty. You're done. The ship is at a severe angle. Water's coming into the wireless room. And he says, it's every man for himself. And then he leaves. But Harold Bride and Jack Phillips stay at their posts. Why? Because there's still power. The dynamos are still running. The ship still has power, and they are praying they can send out a signal that some ship close enough to them will do something. This strange ship, everybody sees this light, the Californian. They've been Morseing it. They've been knowing all sorts of things, thinking the rockets will bring it. But this strange ship just sits there and comes no closer. Now, on the far side is Mount Temple, and it approaches the ice field Titanic. Now, Captain Moore told all his passengers, do not go topside. You're forbidden to go up top. Well, a bunch of passengers sneak up there. They open the door. It's freezing out. It's so cold, it hurts your lungs. And they look off, and they see a ship, that's shooting off rockets and sinking. And they can't believe it. The crew sees the ship, and they can't believe it, because what has Captain Moore done? He stopped the Mount Temple, and he's going no further into the ice field. And these passengers are stunned to see this monstrous ship sinking, shooting off rockets. And the crew demands Captain Moore go closer, but he doesn't. He doesn't want to risk his ship. Meanwhile, Captain Lord, the Californian, he's been dragged up several times to see the rockets, which he said, that is not Titanic, that is some other ship, and I don't know why he's shooting up rockets, but he refuses to move his ship. So basically those second officers on the bridge watch Titanic slowly sink. Meanwhile, Captain Rostrom is coming full speed, doing everything he can to get the position given to him, because they can't pick up anything on the radio anymore, because Titanic's power has died by now. Jack Phillips, Harold Bride have had to finally leave the wireless room. And Titanic starts to sink, while all the first-class passengers watch from the boats as the officers on the California watch her disappear. Now, to them, it looks like she's being swallowed up by the darkness. That's all they see. They say she looks really strange, and she looks like she's either turning away or she's losing her lights. But what they were actually seeing was her is sliding into the water. Still, people were rowing toward the light. People in the rowboats later said we just kept rowing toward the light that we could never get close to. And the crew in the Mount Temple watch as the Mount Temple pulls away, and then they lose sight of the Titanic. And we'll talk about this some more, but all of this, we know all this because all these people talked to the newspapers when they came on shore. Now, at 2:20 a.m., Titanic sinks. Now, we know she broke in two because of finding it in 1985. But interestingly enough, a lot of the accounts, like Lawrence Beasley, the schoolmaster, who was very literary, wrote a great literary account of it. They didn't see it break. Some did, some didn't. So I think a lot of them were in shock. I think a lot of it was their vantage point. But it's interesting, they didn't all say she broke in two. But now we have the worst moment of Titanic. This is the absolute worst. This is an actual picture of a doll on the bottom of the Atlantic. There's 1,500 people in the water. Now they aren't drowning, they're freezing to death because it's less than 20 degrees in that water, Fahrenheit, all right? And so what happens to people, they said, the survivors said it felt like 1,000 knots when you hit the water. A lot of people just had heart attacks right away. But within 15, 20 minutes, these people were all dead. But before they died, all the people in the lifeboats had to listen to their cries. A lot of them said it sounded like locusts on a summer night. A lot of them said it sounded like on a ball game when you hit a ball and the crowd roars. And then the eeriest thing they said was that it was like a death moan all in the same pitch. Now here's the sad, sad underbelly of all this. Some people said, let's go back and get them. These boats were underloaded. There's only 700 people. It could hold 1,175. What happens? Only one boat goes back. And when she goes back, everybody's dead already. It's like they can rescue 3 people and that's it. So this moment of sort of truth for these people in the boats is horrible because, you know, this is where Molly Brown got the moniker, the unsequel Molly Brown, because she wanted to go back. But everybody else said, no, we'll get swamped. You want to die? We'll get swamped. But I wanted to show you those boats. I want to show you how reinforced and how tall they were because they could have gone back. They could have gone back, taken some people, you know, rowed back away, taken some people, rowed back away, but they didn't. They didn't. And this is just one of the darker secrets of Titanic. Now, this is a actual photo of Carpathia survivors taken from the Carpathia by the passengers. Now, this boat looks fully loaded, and that's because what they did was once they were out there, they transferred people to the boats that were going to Carpathia. Carpathia at 3:30 a.m. reaches where she thought Titanic was, and she realizes she sunk, that she's not there. And he can't even see any lifeboats. And so Captain Rostrom is horrified, but then he sees a little green flare because one of the officers had a flare gun. And so he realized he then sees the lifeboats. So they start hoisting people in because they're so cold they can't even climb up the ladders into Carpathia. And so this is this is the rescue operation of Titanic. You know, it's been really seen under a lot of the mythology and the movies and everything else, but this is the great triumph of wireless technology. By the way, Jack Phillips is dead by now. He drowns, he freezes to death. Harold Bride ends up under an overturned boat, and then he climbs on top of it, basically laying across the keel with his feet frozen into like 2 blocks of ice, but he's going to survive. Now, here's some actual photos taken from Carpathia. Again, this is a little bit more realistic. You can see there's a lot of room in this boat, and you can see, these people are freezing. And by the way, they all thought they were just going to freeze to death in the Atlantic. And Harold Bride said, no, the Carpathia is on the way. So not only did he call the ships, but he let everybody know, you're not going to die out. We've got a ship coming. If there were not wireless operator, if wireless was not on Titanic today, it would be the great mystery. We'd be like, what happened to Titanic? Nobody would know. Now, this actual photo, there's a little girl with a Browning camera took this. And these are actual photos right after they got onto Carpathia. And Lawrence B., the schoolmaster, said it was deathly. But hear a pin drop. Nobody talked. These women lost their husbands. So they all are realizing they're widows now. Now, Harold Bride passes out when he gets aboard the Carpathia, but the whole world wants to talk to him. Why? Because he knows what happened to Titanic. He's the surviving wireless man now, right? And it gets worse. Carpathia's wireless man, he falls over from exhaustion. He just can't keep sending all these. He has to send all these lists of passengers who survived and passengers who died, and he just can't do it. So Harold Bride takes over. But he gets a secret message from Marconi. And this is how I open my book. Who says, listen, don't talk to anyone. Don't tell anybody the story. I set you up a deal where you're going to get $1,000 to talk to the New York Times. Just keep your mouth shut. And so he does. He doesn't even the president tries to contact Ship. Bride won't talk to him. Bride claims it's because, he was just too busy with other things. But Marconi told him $1,000 was a lot of money at this time. Now, the California, finally at about 4 a.m., one of the officers goes down and wakes up the wireless man who gets on, and they like, yes, Titanic sunk. They go tell Lord. Lord's like, no. He goes, that's not right. I need confirmation. They get confirmation. Lord's in shock. And even then, he doesn't go right to where she sank. He goes around the field to go in slowly. The Carpathia arrives in New York with the survivors. Now, Carpathia was assaulted with all these ships when she came to harbor. Newsmen literally throwing money onto the ship and, in capsules telling the survivors, jump overboard, we'll pick you up and pay you for your story. And when these ships are taken in by a harbor pilot, and the pilot boards, they all tried to jump on. They had to be punched and shoved off the boat. People are frantic to find out what really happened to the Titanic. And the one man they all want to talk to is this guy. Now, what Marconi does, when the ship docks, he goes on board the Carpathia, goes right to the wireless room. Harold Bride is still sending messages. He says, you're done, son. Your job is finished. He looks up, sees Mr. Marconi. He takes him off the ship. You can see him, this actual photo being taken off ship. You see his feet bandaged there. To a car, takes him to a hotel where he sits down with Marconi and these reporters and tells the New York Times exactly what happened, giving the New York Times the scoop of the century. Now, the California comes in and Captain Lord forbids any of his crew to talk to anybody. But guess what? They're like, forget it. They all talk to reporters. Look what comes out. California refused to aid the Titanic. Distress rockets plainly visible at the time, says engineer. Captain Lord makes denial. Captain Lord wanted nothing more but just turn his ship around and go back to England. He can't do it. He gets pulled into the official Senate inquiry because people let him know that he could have rescued everybody on Titanic. He tries to double talk his way out of it, especially about the rockets, but they just nail him and say, you could have come to aid Titanic, but you didn't, and they hold him guilty. He's disgraced. There's a British inquiry, and they eviscerate him basically for not going to the aid of Titanic. He's disgraced for life. This begins a whole sort of conspiracy thing that goes on today where people think he was scapegoated. His son petitioned Congress to reopen the investigation in the 1980s to clear his name. But the fact of the matter is, because there's all these theories, there were mystery ships and stuff. The fact of the matter is there was only one ship out there sinking, sending off rockets, and that was Titanic, and they were only 10 miles away. So he was found not guilty of coming to the aid of Titanic and saving countless lives. Now, Captain Moore, okay, of the Mount Temple, he too was pulled into the inquiry, but he sort of escapes, and they sort of let him go. But what he didn't escape was the passengers all talk to the media. And in fact, it gets worse. They sent certified letters to the Congress saying what they saw, that he could have gone in. The crew talked to the media. So then book after book has come out since saying, explain exactly what happened and how he didn't go into that ice field. Now the newspapers, and a lot of the mythology began here, they didn't know a lot of what happened except for what Titanic surviving wireless man told them, which is down here at the bottom. But you can see even at the top, I'll follow the last words of Captain Smith. This was all just made because Captain Smith said nothing. He just disappeared into history. But the Harold Bride's story makes the world over, is run all in all the newspapers. And this becomes the official account of what happened to Titanic. Captain Rostrom, he gets the Congressional Medal of Honor for rescuing the 700 plus people. Congress gives him this, the British give him a medal, the women's groups give him medals. He's just lauded as human beings at their best, as a true hero. So Titanic really, from this moment on is in history. Walter Lord's book came out first, and I'm going to, this sort of the one that laid the sort of foundation for a lot of the history to follow. I'll read you just the end of my book. We would like to think that we would react as Captain Rostrom did. We went our way through icebergs, putting every ounce of steam into our engines, going through the night with the only purpose being that of rescuing those in distress. Or that if we were in lifeboats and saw the 1,500 people drowning and our lifeboat was half full, we would demand to go back and risk getting swamped to save those we could. This is the human ideal, and it's almost impossible to know if we would turn back from the ice as Captain Moore did, or refuse to recognize the ship plainly in view, firing distress rockets as Captain Lord did. The truth is that human beings are a blend, and that's why we all sit back and doff our hats to the hero. They may be rarer than we like to think. But there were real heroes that night, and we're once again back to those two wireless operators, Phillips and Bride, tapping away and sending out their basic question again. Is a universal question really, a very human cry that comes down through the years and still tests us every time we hear it. On the Titanic, lying on the ocean floor, the wireless set from 1912 remains. And it's fitting that as of this writing, there's a plan for it to be brought back to the surface by underwater robots. Many feel this will be a fitting tribute to Harold Bride and Jack Phillips, and perhaps it will have one last message embedded in its transmitter coils. Undoubtedly, if they could extract that last plea, that last electromagnetic impulse, it would be that very human question we still ask of one another: will you come help us? And that is 160 minutes. And I can take questions you have. Any questions you have at all.
I'm making sure that I unmute everyone, or at least allow them to unmute themselves if they like.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you, Dennis.
Oh, I'm just trying to make sure that I at least enable everyone to unmute if they'd like to. Well, William, being a librarian.
Yeah, if anybody wants to put anything in the chat.
Oh, yeah, sure. Post and put things in the chat too. I am always curious about the research angle. So it sounds like you consulted certainly some of the, I guess what you consider the standard kinds of sources, but it sounds like you must have done more investigative work than just reading the things that were currently the published things that were currently available. What, because you gathered a lot of information here. What kinds of other sources did you look at, or how did you gather the information that you have for this book?
Senate inquiry left a lot of pages of testimony, and I pulled quite a bit from that. I pulled from other, a lot of diaries, a lot of letters, a lot of books by the passengers themselves. You know, a lot of this is in plain sight, to be honest with you. There's no smoking gun with in a lot of history. Found this diary in that, trunk, and guess what? It was at Gettysburg, the North one, or the South one in Gettysburg, the North lost. So I mean, usually what I find is a lot of the material, primary, secondary, has been looked at by a lot of people, but they don't, for some reason, they don't put it together the way I do. And so I look and I go, no, that's probably not quite the way it happened. And so then I just take a different take on it. How many passengers wrote books about their experience? Quite a few. It's a question. How many passengers wrote books about their experience? Quite a few. Jack Thayer, who was a 17-year-old, wrote a book in 1940. It was a really great book because he was stuck on that ship until he had to jump into the water as a 17-year-old. He was separated from his mother and father. He never saw his father again. He did see his mother on the Carpathia. He left behind this great account where he said, basically, the Titanic was this rated the 19th Edwardian era from the 20th century, and before Titanic, life had a symmetry. The airplane had just come; it wasn't this instrument of death. The automobile hadn't taken over the world. Life seemed to go on in a much calmer way. He said, after Titanic, all the carnage of the 20th century seemed unleashed. Which a lot of people have sort of pointed that the Titanic was this dividing line between the old sort of Edwardian world, the sort of placidity of that world, and then the crazy megadeath of the 20th century.
William, did you find when you started getting involved in this story, the emotionality of it for yourself was bigger than maybe you thought it might have been?
When I was writing it, it was during, especially the rewrite during a lot of the pandemic. And so what was interesting about it was that, the scenes where the third class found themselves, the 1,500 people found themselves stuck on that ship with not enough boats. I thought that was very much like the early days when the vaccine came out and nobody could get it. And people were scrambling, trying to figure ways to get it because they didn't have enough of it. Nobody was sure who would get it. And I really knew how those people felt on the ship, with just too few boats and the sort of every man for himself feeling that if you don't do something to save yourself, you were doomed. And I think a lot of people felt that in the early days of the pandemic where, when they started coming with the vaccine, but most people couldn't get it.
That's an incredibly good parallel.
Yeah, it just came to me when I was doing the rewriting, and I was, and I think that informed it definitely. I mean, because for the first time, you sort of understood what it was like to be in a super tragic situation that could also take you down with it. Another question by anybody? And I can look at the chat if you want to put in chat. I think a lot of these people, they can't unmute themselves.
I think everybody should be able to unmute yourself now.
Oh,
here, let me do this again.
Yeah.
So if you'd like to speak, you should be in good shape.
Oh, here we go. Okay, great. Well, I like to talk. Are all the accounts the same? Our only counts the same since the boats. Since the boats were not filled to capacity, should there have been enough room for the staff too? No, most of the pursers, the stewards, the stokers, most of the people who worked on Titanic went down with Titanic. A few made it into the boats because they would say, we need one man, and so they would grab somebody and throw them in the boat, and they needed somebody to row. So you had, a strange situation of a guy who shovels coal in the bowels of Titanic. Most of those guys didn't make it up, but a few did. With women that were, and men, not usually no men, but women who were, a few probably worth almost $1 billion in our money at that time. That's the thing that's incredible about Titanic. You had this incredible amount of wealth sitting in those life pits, watching a lot of immigrants drown. And what a parable for the Gilded Age, right? Where just massive amounts of people were used up in huge industries, unregulated, untaxed, and so now they're on this ship, and the ruling classes mostly made it into the boats, but the people who were coming to America and such for a better life, no, not really. So there was, but most people with Titanic who worked for Titanic, it was 80% died, something like that.
That's another really amazing parallel, William.
We have your book here at the library. I can't wait to read it.
So what ultimately did the wireless operator who survived go on to do with his life?
Okay, actually, good question. What did the wireless operator do? Jack Phillip, or rather Harold Bride, afterward, and I only know this because, again, the newspapers were a great resource, but there was a little article in one of the New York papers that he went to live with his sister for a while to recover. And he did go back to sea for a while as a wireless operator, but then he left the service, and I think he became a salesman then. He had had enough. A lot of these people suffered horrible, what we would call today PTSD. There were suicides among a lot of the people who survived Titanic. A lot of people could not get the sound out of their heads of all those people drowning, or rather freezing to death. And like Bruce Ismay, the director who famously jumped into a boat and survived, and was pillared for that, was just looked down upon by everyone. He went into seclusion, never came out. He was mentally destroyed. He went into his estate and never appeared again. He just wouldn't see people then. So we don't have a lot of follow-up on this, but there was one book I read where he sort of went through a lot of the survivors, and a lot of them, had definitely PTSD, suicide, just couldn't shake it. And again, the one reason there was a lot of mythology around this event too was that people had never seen death on this scale before. This is before World War I. So to have 1,500 people die all at once, people weren't used to that. They weren't used to hearing about it, seeing it, anything to do with it. It was not what we're used to. And so the people that were witnesses to it, some wrote books, some went on with their lives just fine, some not so much,
How about the 14-year-old who first heard the distress signal?
Yeah, Jimmy Merrick. Well, he's great because he waited till everybody had passed who, he had promised not to say anything. And then he told the newspapers what happened to him. And there was another young man there was Cape Race, and then there was another land station about another 100 miles away. Same situation, a 17-year-old was in there. He heard the first signals. And again, he was sworn to silence. And finally, his wife told a newspaper in the 1960s that her husband had been one of the first to hear Titanic as a 17-year-old, and then he reluctantly told the newspaper. But, you know, a lot of this mythology falls away slowly. Let's take the band that is in the movie and is in just about everything, all the movies, there's been 3 or 4, and the band played on. Well, the woman in 1965 who survived said, that's ridiculous. She said, first of all, it was freezing. All the instrument strings would have snapped. Second of all, the ship was at such an angle they couldn't have stood. Third of all, and this is a big point, and this has been backed up by everybody, all those boilers, like 24 or 29, I can't remember what it was, these are steam engines. So you built up all the steam in these boilers to get it going. Titanic was going full speed, 23, 24 knots into the ice field. All the boilers were stoked up. All that steam had to be blown off. So they blew off all the steam from the funnels, and that made such a racket. It sounded like 100 locomotives letting off steam at once. Nobody could hear anything. In fact, Lightoller and others had to use hand signals to get people into the boats. And she said, there's no way anybody could hear a band with all that steam being blown off. So there you go. To her way of thinking, this woman who was there, she's like, that's ridiculous. But there are other people who said, no, we heard the band. So maybe they played a little, maybe it was on one part of the ship. Maybe this is a monstrous ship. And there was no amplification. So if they're out there playing their little, you know, Closer to Thee, which they said they played, you know, okay, 10 people could hear it for a little bit. But again, the mythology of it is that you think the band was just, and if you see the movie, the band's right there just playing the whole time. So, you know, you have to sort of use common sense with a lot of this stuff. Another question, let's see, okay. Since the boats have not filled, no one is still alive from the ship, correct? Yeah, everybody has passed. Again, the last person to pass was, her last name was Melvina. Oh, and that was her first name, I think, Melvina. And she was 100 and something. She passed in the 21st century. I'm not sure exactly the date. So yeah, that's also why Walter Lord's book made it into so many other histories, because, you know, here's a guy who talked to all of them. And so, but I found Lawrence Beasley, Jack Thayer's books, diaries were very informative and really, you know, again, if you read them and you say, okay, so how did this really happen? And then the accounts, the newspaper accounts from the passengers aboard the Mount Temple and the California are stunning, because these people all weren't in cahoots. They all told different papers the same story, that they saw the Titanic. So there was no vested interest, you know, but the conspiracy theorists all say that they were paid off, that this was made up, all this stuff. Believe me, I get so much blowback from this stuff when I bring a book out like this, because there's people who just don't want to give up the idea the Titanic was exactly the great Greek tragedy that was presented, where, you know, men were men and women went off in the boats and they went down like gentlemen and all that stuff. But that's not really the way it happened. It was actually a night of a lot of human failure. Any more questions?
William, would that be your sort of summary statement, the one you just made, about that it's not the sort of over glorified, over simplified myth? It really was a human, you say human failure?
Human failing, yeah. It was a lot of, I mean, Captain Rostrum, Jack Phillips, Harold Bride, these are the examples that we like to look at. But as I said in the summation of the book, heroes are a lot rarer than we think. And, you know, all those people that sat in those boats and then come back and pick up the 300 to 400 people that would have fit into those boats, that's a horrible moment. You know, that's I made it, you didn't, and I'm not going to come back and risk anything to help you. Again, some people wanted to go back, but they were shouted down. And then, of course, you know, Captain Lord was found guilty. I mean, there's people called Lordites who just believe all this is just, you know, made up stuff, but it's ridiculous. He was found guilty. They, even though he tried to say everything he could, that was another ship, it wasn't Titanic and every other thing. They said, no, there's only one ship sending off rockets, that all your officers, passengers, people, the stokers, they all saw it. And you could have come to their aid. So he was convicted. Again, on the Mount Temple, there was lots of testimonials from the passengers. Captain Moore did deny seeing the Titanic, but he also said, it's my job not to risk a ship and take it to the ice field. So you had it both ways, really. He wasn't going to that ice field. That's the bottom line. So.
Well, anybody else for questions either in the chat or verbally?
Well, I will say this, this book just came out September 1st, and you can go to my website, or you can just put in WGN with the name of the book or me, and you will see this great interview from Rick Cogan. I also did one with John Records Landecker at WGN. You can listen to that one. They're both good interviews. And the article from Cogan's great too. And you can buy the book anywhere.
Well,
Thank you, William.
Absolutely.
Thank you all who attended too. And actually one of the things, so for those of you who are still on, William has graciously agreed to let us put the recording of this program on the library's YouTube channel, which is accessible through the library's website. And actually those interviews, William, I'll bet that we could download those interviews and provide links to them too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they're all over the net. I probably did 10 radio interviews. I did Talk Radio Europe. That's on there too. I did WBBM. He's going to probably with Richard Hart, I think is his name, Rob Hart. He's posting that probably tomorrow. So that's WBM News Radio. And I am going to be on WGN television in early November for an interview. So I'll tweet it out.
Yeah, that would be great.
Absolutely.
Well, and we're really lucky to have you on this early after the release of the book too. Everything is
yeah. It's a lot of fun right now because it just came out, and and I hit the high points. There's so much more in the book. I mean, I'm skimming the mountaintops. There's just so much more in the book. Oh, bravo! I like that.
Well, I think at this point, if there aren't further questions, we can release you, William.
Uh-oh. What will I do with myself the rest of the night?
And thank you so much. It has just been lovely to have someone who writes as well as you do, and writes on so many topics, to have you on for these programs, William. It's really been great.
Yeah,
really
thanks for having me. Look forward to the next one.
Well, we do too.
We've got a lot to choose from.
Well, we sure do. And actually, I'm going to spend, I know we talked about the Wright brothers, but I'm going to spend some more time on your website, just poking around to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Because Cassie Chadwick or Plot to Kidnap George Washington, we can look at all those.
Yeah, very cool. Well, William, thank you again. And thanks to everyone who attended. We really appreciate your participation. And well, William, we look forward to hearing from you live again, but also remember, folks, that you can as soon as we get the video converted and on the YouTube channel, you can hear William that way too.
Talk to you soon.
Okay, terrific. Thank you again. Have a good night.